You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and in today's episode, Matthieu, Tom, and I will jump more than 8,000 years into the future to discuss one of 2021's hottest and most acclaimed blockbusters, Denis Villeneuve's Dune. We'll explore the intrigues of this galaxy that could be far, far away, break down the futuristic vision, the characters and the casting, the plot, and of course the direction and the visuals. Because if there's one thing you cannot take away from this film, it's the fact that it's absolutely stunning. And don't worry, there won't be any spoilers until the very end. There'll even be a clear spoiler warning before that point. So if you're one of the few people yet to see it, don't worry, we've got your back. You can lean back and enjoy as we get to the bottom of how ridiculous or eerily accurate it could be that bagpipes are genuinely the true musical instrument of war in the future. We will also answer the pressing question, is this what a blockbuster should be? And is there a genuine future for blockbusters with artistic visions? And displaying far less respect, we'll throw in a totally new section that I like to call the pulp factor, where we'll score just how pulpy or not we think Villeneuve's Dune actually is. Oh, and yes, obligatory comparisons to Lynch's version are included. But before we get to any of that, let me bring my co-host into the conversation, and perhaps it would be good to start with a bit of a temperature check so that both you and I know where they're coming from. So, Tom, let's start with you. What did you think of Villeneuve's Dune? Do you have a scathing one-line review?
I absolutely loved Dune. It is so far my favourite film of the year that I've seen out of 49 films. It ticks all of my boxes. It's just this beautiful, grand sci-fi with an epic scale, and it delivered. So yeah, I'm a very happy bunny with Dune.
Here we have at least one strong defender of Dune here. But what about you, Matthieu? I know that Blade Runner 2049 was actually your favorite film of 2019. Did Dune live up to your hopes?
Well, in some ways, Dune was impressive, but I wasn't entirely convinced by a film that I think really plays like a part one. And as such, it feels difficult to even judge it. Without part two, to me it did not quite feel like a whole, is what I would say. So impressive in some ways, but did not quite live up to expectations. To answer your question.
Yeah, I suppose that that kind of disappointment is a bit built in a film that's literally called Part 1. So, feeling it's not even like a standalone film in a franchise with obligatory sequel tie-ins. It's just genuinely Part 1 of a story, which is a very interesting choice, let's say. On my part, I am more inclined to agree with Tom. I think it's absolutely stunning. Like I mentioned in my intro, I think that it's just beautifully done. It's an intricate world that's so well built. It's delicious to look at. I thought many of the performances were great. I think the atmosphere is strong, but I think it does run an issue of taking some of its elements a bit too seriously and including some, shall we say, pulpy elements or some dialogue, etc. that's just delivered a bit oddly and didn't work as well for me. But overall, a great film, and in terms of pulpiness, I'll get more into that in the later segment. But to expand on your thoughts here a little bit, and perhaps we can start with a bit of positivity. What stood out to you the most? Did anything just blow you away in this film?
A lot of the special effects worked really well for me. I watched the film on an IMAX screen and it was just so immersive. the whole sound design and the set design and the visuals, they were just breathtaking. It genuinely transports you to another world. And we don't often get that on this sense of scale with a blockbuster by such a talented director with an incredible vision. I mean, most of his previous films are favourites of mine, and I just thought it was incredible. It makes a complex story seem relatively straightforward and accessible. I must add a disclaimer here that I haven't actually read any of the novels. I did try to read Dune when I was a teenager, but I didn't stick with it. But watching this film has made me want to return to the novel because I'm very excited to spend a lot more time in this world if possible.
Yeah, if we're adding that disclaimer, I think I have to also say that I have not read the novel. What about you, Matthieu?
Well, I have read the original novel. I haven't read the sequels, but it's only the original novel that is really relevant here. And I think that kind of played a role, maybe, in my reaction. In terms of the visuals and the set design, the aesthetics in general, I think I've come to expect what we got, essentially, from Denis Villeneuve, even though this is on a much bigger scale than what he did in Arrival and in Blade Runner 2049. I think maybe I had a muted reaction, even though it's undeniable that this is a grand epic spectacle with, it definitely has that spectacle aspect to it, and I think it succeeds in that way. But I don't know why, I just wasn't quite blown over, and I think part of it is that familiarity with Villeneuve and also with the books, because I think there's a lot of joy in discovery with a world like Dune, right, which has all of these various elements that you get to see. And I think maybe it's not the same when it's like, oh yeah, I know this, it's from the books. So like there were some design elements that I loved, like the shields, the way he does the shields, the ornithopters. There's a lot to like, but it was more recognition than being blown away, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Especially if you're just seeing the plot points being checked off point by point, I can see why it would be as exciting for you. I can also, I suppose, add in that, yes, this is the standard we've come to expect from Villeneuve.
And that's not a criticism. Obviously, Villeneuve can do anything about the fact that he's adapting an existing work. I'm just kind of trying to understand why I didn't love this as much as I would have liked to.
I suppose one thing that could go for any of Villeneuve's films, and I'm actually going to ask more about him as a sci-fi director and blockbuster director later, but he is a bit of a cold and calculated director, which can work really, really well, but he's really just telling the story here. He's telling the story with great visuals and great atmosphere, setting, etc., but it is really just that story told in a very classic way. So it's interesting to just see the tale told like with such a classic, slow brooding style, where it's really just is the plot taking the lead.
I think it's worth delving into that cold clinical style a bit further, Chris, because it does suit Dune's story really well. I love sci-fi films that they don't have a crisp, clean and beautiful vision of the future. I like how it's grimy and dirty, on a desert planet. And I think Villeneuve does that. Sorry, I've done it. I've done a bad pronunciation there.
Okay, so Villeneuve is how it is.
Yeah.
Oh, Villeneuve. Okay, Villeneuve. Thank you.
And Villeneuve does that really well here. The one thing that I think is quite lacking it in his adaptation is perhaps in some of the performances. I would say that the emotional side of the film, the heavy lifting is done more by the soundtrack and the visuals that create this atmosphere and experience rather than the performances of the characters. I'm not sure if you agree with me on that, but that was how I interpreted the film.
I think I agree. Yeah.
I completely agree, as Chris was about to say as well. I think the score especially, it has that, the score and the visuals, it kind of plays that role. I think it's the only maybe theme I could find really in what Villeneuve was doing with this film, is the idea of being completely struck down. Maybe that's not quite right, but you feel overwhelmed by the score and by the set design. And I think in the same way that the main character is overwhelmed by everything that the world around him is doing, right? In a sense, everything that's expected of him. And I think in that sense, I agree that the soundtrack, the score, and the set design do more character building than really the performances do, which is not to say that the performances are bad, but I could not really, aside from one we'll talk about later, I could not really pick one of the main performers that's really impressed me in that way.
Yeah, sure, because I don't feel that anyone put forward a particularly mesmerising performance, but at the same time, I don't feel there was any weaknesses in the cast. I think everyone did exactly what was required, but it was Villeneuve's direction that really lifted and elevated the film for me.
Yeah, like I was about to say, I completely agree. And I think it ties a little bit to the cold and clinical style and a little bit to what I talked about with classic presentation too, because it's not really like amplifying emotional atmosphere or anything of that kind. The characters here or the performers bringing the characters to life are doing it almost more with just how they look and express themselves. Almost a little, not quite like statues. I mean, this is not Robert Bresson, but they're kind of, it's kind of iconographic in a way. It's really just, you have, especially if you look at the Harkonnen family, but even with the Atreides as well, you just get that look down, and then the actors embody these characters and these icons almost, if you will, and they do a really good job. But I don't really think that, perhaps with some exceptions, I think Timothée Chalamet does bring a decent bit into his role, for instance, but I don't think the emotions are what carries this through, or the acting is what carries this through. I think they're really just embodying this kind of really classic iconography, which is really interesting to see in a modern blockbuster.
Yeah, you bring up coldness, Chris, and I think that's really important, right? This is an extremely cold film, and you could say that of most of Villeneuve's films, and I think that's part of my reservation with the part one versus part two thing, right? Because I think there is the film needs the story needs at one point to bring some warmth in, but naturally that's something that would more happen in part two, and so that's where I'm kind of in suspended judgment about this film, right? Because it really feels like, yeah, it is a part one, and so I'm waiting to see if Villeneuve can make that switch. Yeah, we'll see. It's really impossible to tell, especially with the Zendaya character, right, which is basically non-existent here. I mean, it's basically a tease, and so we'll see what comes of that. But it's impossible to say now.
Or if he even wants to do that, if he even wants to bring in that warmth. I mean, it might be that he just refuses to do it.
It might be. I don't think I want that, but it's possible that he might convince me. You never know. It's our good old debate, Chris. It always comes back.
It's true. Yes, we always go on about this. You want the warmth, I want the coldness. No, and in this case, I mean, I think it's one of those films that a lot of people could argue to be like technically flawless. It's one of those really masterly well done films. But I could actually have used a bit more warmth here, especially given the kind of material it seeks to adapt. Because you can tell that the original writing is not cold. Like, the original writing has a lot of comedy in it. And I think by not really bringing that out, the film loses something.
Yeah, I think more than comedy, there's the writing. It's a well written book, Dune. You haven't read it, but the style of it is quite notable. And there's also kind of sensuality to the way Herbert writes, which is not really present here. But again, it shows up more in the second part, so how to say.
I think the odd elements of comedy that were used, I just remember a couple of lines throughout the film, didn't really work for me. They felt more like lines that were introduced to the film purely to create a trailer that would appeal to the masses, like, oh, look, this film has got some humour in it, like the superhero films that we see so often. And I found that it was kind of jarring in a way.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this was the worst part of the film. I think there's this one really early scene, for instance, where essentially the Emperor's entourage is arriving to give the news that the family is going to take over Arrakis. And Oscar Isaac's Duke Leto tells Gurney, his sidekick, essentially his second in command, to smile. And Josh Brolin, just as Gurney just goes, I am smiling. And it's like that's this kind of, like, it's really this 80s, 70s, 60s humor, where it's where you kind of just pump up the comedy and you have this kind of slightly more pulpy or even campy or just like more fun-loving film. Like this works, but here, that's not the atmosphere at all. The atmosphere doesn't call for it. The atmosphere is the same, cold, really well composed, beautiful. In this scene, even colorful. You get the Benjamin Clementine cameo as the Herald of Change. Like, it's almost dancing out. It's just this big set piece that's so well calculated. It doesn't work. It doesn't belong there at all.
I would totally agree with that, and that was one of the lines that I was referring to. It just felt out of place, and it wasn't really required then. As you'd say, it's a very serious film, and Villeneuve takes it very seriously. So these little elements of humour don't really work very well.
Yeah, I think they're really at odds with what the film is doing, and that can be good in some way. I think the character of Duncan Idaho is an example of where it kind of works, right? To have a character that's kind of at odds with the tone of the film. But yeah, I agree with that particular example that it feels pretty out of place, not in a great way.
I'm not sure if even Duncan Idaho fits that well with the film. I have no complaints about Jason Momoa. I think he's just as solid as everyone else. But that role in particular is probably one of, and this storyline for that character is without a doubt, one of the more out of place things in this film, just compared to the rest of the tone, because that again really is 80s comedy, not necessarily 80s action comedy or space adventure, space opera style character plotting. It just feels so odd that it's there.
Well, see, to me, he's a bright spot. I was mentioning earlier that there's one performance that I think stands out, and I think it's his. I think the reason for that is, as I mentioned, I want to know if Villeneuve is cold just because that's who he is, or if he's being purposeful. And I think that character is giving me hope that he is being purposeful with the way he is being super cold and super overwhelming again. Because these are characters that are kind of stuck in this political intrigue, in these huge issues that are much bigger than themselves. And Duncan Idaho is this character who is kind of outside of that. And I think that's why the fact that he's so different from the rest is actually something I would say is a positive for me.
I would agree. I thought that Duncan's narrative was a great part of the film, to be honest. Momoa's performance was really good. And as Matthieu would say, it's great to see another side of the Atreides. Is it? I'm going to do another awful pronunciation here. Is it? What's their fan called?
I think they pronounce it Atreides in the film.
Okay. It's great to see another side of the Atreides clan, because we're dealing with the key members of the family for the majority of films. So it's good to see more of a common man, I would say, and he brings a lot of heart to the role. And I thought his narrative worked particularly well.
I mean, honestly, he's the only character who feels like a human being.
Not sure if I entirely agree with that, but we can probably expand that discussion for the pulp section. Is sure. There anything else about this film that you thought didn't work, or which hurt it in some way?
There was a part that didn't work for me, but I think we'll have to save that for the spoilers territory. But to be honest, I think we're getting bogged down in things that didn't work, because I feel like we've just been laying into a film that I absolutely love for the past 10 minutes, which feels really wrong. But I mean, it's fine to criticise it, I suppose. But really, I want to be building this film up because I had a great time with it.
Yeah, me too. So let's try to brighten up the positivity here. Then, is there anything else that you thought really stood out in the film?
I mean, I don't think we have to bring it to everyone's attention because they're all already aware of it, but these sandworms, they were incredible.
Oh, yes.
I thought they were actually done quite well in Lynch's version, but here they were just astounding. I mean, there's the clip in the trailer where you see the worm just make the first huge appearance, and that is breathtaking. It's absolutely incredible, and I think that worked really well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, they look spectacular.
Yeah, I also have a good memory of the worms in the Lynch film, actually. But yeah, I think they were good. I also think he's keeping it. He's not quite giving you the full thing, right? I mean, you see a decent bit of the worm, but it's at night. It's very good, but I feel like he's really keeping the grand spectacle of the worms for later still. But yeah, I agree that the worms are really good.
I think it's also a question of less is more and just building it all up.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd also like to mention the action scenes as well. There's a particular battle taking place on a flight of stairs that I thought was choreographed wonderfully. It doesn't go on for that long. It doesn't give you a lot to really grab hold of, but in the short time and space that we see it, it's incredibly visceral and memorable, and I thought that stood out quite well for me.
Yeah, I think the fight scenes, well, especially it's the way that Villeneuve uses the shields. I think that really makes the fight scenes have a sense of personality that can be hard to achieve in a film like this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I agree that the fight scenes are quite good.
Yeah, I completely I agree here. I think that the choreography here is spot on. And the shields do absolutely add something. And I really like how reasonable they're done. Like, these are not impenetrable shields. They're not some kind of absolute magic. They're just like a little bit of extra armor. And I think it's handled in a very intriguing way. And it's used to amplify tensions in some places where you're wondering how long will, this armor last. So I really think that it's done, that part is also done exceptionally well. Essentially all of the technology brought into this film, from spaceship design to weapons to the towns themselves. I think all of these details that really work, it makes the world come alive, feel realistic, feel lived in. So I really want to praise all of the set designers and prop makers, etc., and the action coordinators, because they did a wonderful job.
I would definitely agree with how realistic and believable it is. This incredible world just comes to life. And even in the simple choices, such as having some of the soldiers, how they drop down from the sky, just slowly float down, it feels so otherworldly, yet it also feels really natural in the sense of the film. And these little touches really elevate it to the next level.
When we're talking about realism, I think the one thing that perhaps may feel slightly off is the fact that we are over 8,000 years in the future, but the world structure has essentially returned to the Middle Ages with the large empires. You have clans. The Atreides families essentially here almost feels like, a Scottish war clan in a way. It's like, how realistic do you think it is, or does it need to be realistic at all? But how do you think of a future that many thousand years in the future that kind of has this system that's so similar to what we had such a long time ago?
Yeah, I think it's a little ridiculous, but I don't think it's supposed to be realistic, right? It's set 1,000 years in the future. It should not be this easily recognizable as a political system, but it's easy to say, but harder to imagine something that we would not recognize, right? So it's more. I don't think this is an anticipation story, right? It's not a story that is trying to predict what will happen to humanity. I don't think that's what he's doing at all. I think what Herbert and Villeneuve now are doing is more. Well, I don't know what Villeneuve is doing because it's part one, but it's more. An idea of colonialism, maybe. I see a lot more of colonialism along with some empire structures that are kind of resemble feudal lords. But to me, it's much more about colonialism because we have this story of very Lawrence of Arabia, right? Of this protagonist, which is going to go among the desert natives. So I guess it makes me think more of that. I think it's fine. It does not bother me. It's a complex political system with people acting in their interest, and I think that it makes sense internally, and that is what matters, I think.
I would agree. It's definitely easy to buy into this world. And as Matthieu said, it's not meant to be, a prediction of our future. It's just an imagined alternative future, perhaps. And it's kind of relatable as well, the story, the battle over the resources, etc. It's very grounded in human plights that are relatable in some respect. So I think Villeneuve does a great job of adapting the material. Although it's difficult to say when I've not read the book, but I mean, what he does with the source novel is commendable because he's made an exceptional film. So I am looking forward to delving into the books.
Yeah, it's a book that was written in the 70s, and you feel it with the spice. Red spice is like both oil and LSD. And so that's a very uniquely 70s or 60s combination. Anyway, I do think it's all very interesting, the world that is created here. Whether or not it relates to what would happen, I think it's irrelevant.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it is a space opera, and I mean, we can talk about how silly it is that they're using the bagpipe as their chief musical instrument in approaching wars and battles in 8,000 years in the future, but like you don't really care about that.
Yeah, the fact that he went with Scotland for the Atreides planet is kind of funny because the way it's described in the book is it's basically described as Earth, right? It's just a planet with a lot of water and some land that some of it is green. And so I think we assume because of Star Wars that when we see one scene on the planet, that's all of the planet is. And so yeah, I think it's funny that it becomes the Scotland planet with the bagpipes and everything.
Yes. And I think Star Wars is a fun point of comparison too, because I mean, I think that they're really, really comparable in terms of scope. The hero with a potential birthright or messianic quality, massive. An empire with a potentially evil emperor constructing everything. It essentially has everything Star Wars has as well. So they're very good side-by-side comparison pieces.
There's also the juxtaposition of sci-fi and fantasy.
Oh yes, absolutely.
There's definitely fantasy element in Dune, the desert, which is central in both of them. But I do think the book Dune and the film, this one anyway, they both do take themselves. They both are more ambitious thematically than Star Wars is. Well, Star Wars is very much a personal story. It's an emotional story, a hero's journey, and it's not about huge issues. What we're not meant to think that hard about how the Empire works. I do think in this case we are meant to think in the long run harder about how the Empire works and how it relates to real political systems.
And Star Wars feels like more of a fun adventure, kind of family-orientated film. I don't know whether I would say the same about Dune, and that's perhaps because of the serious and the cold nature. I can't imagine young children grasping onto Dune as easily as perhaps a Star Wars.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I'm not sure if you could adapt Dune in a way that's very child-friendly. I mean, even Lynch's version was far from child-friendly. So it's a very good question. I think it probably could, but I do agree the material here is a little bit darker.
Yeah, I think this is more child-friendly than the Lynch version, really, if anything.
Absolutely, and I think it would be really fun to just go back and compare these films a little bit as well, because I know that all of us have been catching up with Lynch's Dune before this episode. How would you say they compare?
It's a very difficult comparison because they are two totally different approaches. I wasn't actually going to rewatch Lynch's Dune, but I found myself still awake at 11:30 last night. Why not chuck it on? And I actually only got an hour and a half into the film. I stopped it at the same point that Villeneuve's Dune ended. And it was interesting to note that there's only 45 minutes left to go. So somehow Lynch fits Dune Part 2 into 45 minutes, which might come to explain why his film was derided so much. But I still think that Lynch's film has quite a few redeeming qualities. Again, the set design is impressive for the time that it was made, although some of the effects feel a bit hokey. if you think back, this was 1984. This was 7 years after Star Wars. So we've seen epic space battles, and the effects in some part feel more akin to the kind of thing that you see in the 50s with these dodgy backgrounds, especially when there's spaceships involved. But the actual set designs and the costuming is excellent. But I think that the main issue with it is that there's such a complex story that's being condensed into a small space of runtime. So characters aren't given the full due that is required for audiences to really buy into this film.
Yeah, as much as I have reservations about the Villeneuve version, I do think it's much better, but much more accomplished than the Lynch version, which feels like a compromise between Lynch and a studio, right? Because Lynch was not quite who he is now. And yeah, it has definitely fun aspects. I don't think the worms, as we said, are good. There's a lot of set design that is good. It goes for a very kitschy set design, but it works kind of. I mean, it's just not a very good film. It's just not very, like, attempting to do all of that narratively in such a short time is just very difficult. I definitely understand why Villeneuve went with 2 parts. Yeah, it's a film that is charming in some senses, right? And it's fun to see some of its performances. It's fun to see Kyle MacLachlan in that main role. I think it's pretty good. But yeah, it's kind of, it has its charms, but it's not really successful.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good representation of it. It has its charms. I mean, honestly, for me, this is, and for Lynch actually too, this is the only real failure of his career. I mean, Lynch says this is his one major regret, that he, realized he wasn't a sinking ship and started selling out. And he, like, there was a TV version of this where he even got his name removed from. So he is really unhappy with it. And I think part of the reason why the film only carries on for 45 minutes for Dune Part 2 is the fact that Lynch actually presented a 4-hour cut to the producers, and they cut it, said that 2 hours and 17 minutes or 2 hours and 16 minutes were the absolute max, and essentially forced recuts of all of it. So those last 45 minutes or so almost feel like a collage of just this happened, and it's that part just feels terribly hokey. I think there's a lot of things to appreciate with it. I like both of you think the set design was actually really good. It's clear that a lot of thought went into these places, and regardless of the decade, I think just a lot of the set design looks great. Some of the effects, not so much. I mean, certainly a few steps below Star Wars, but it's a decently looking film, and some of the set design is great. But it's so campy, it's so silly, it's all over the place. It's essentially what you could have expected an adaptation to be based on the comedic elements here, because it does lean into the pulp. It goes beyond the pulp. It goes full on camp silliness, and I'm not sure how well it works. I didn't enjoy it as much as I did the first time. I rewatched it for the first time, the second time I saw it before this episode, and yeah, it just feels like a bit of a mess. It's a silly mess. It's partially enjoyable. There's some moments of greatness there, but yeah, it's Lynch's worst for sure.
It's also the result of, like you can see why Lynch was drawn to the material, right? I mean, dreams are really important in Dune, and obviously we all know that Lynch loves dreams, but it's really the result of him and the studio wanting more of a Star Wars ripoff, essentially, and also the result of this very long, drawn-out process that led to the film, right? The documentary, Jodorowsky's Dune, really shows you how it was an insane project that had to be brought down, and I guess the result had to be compromised, I suppose. It's not. It was kind of an inevitability, it feels like.
Yeah, it's true. And I think it's been a few years since I saw the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune now, but how many hours did he demand his version to be? I think it was over 7 at least.
I don't remember. It's been a few years also, but yeah, extremely long. I mean, his project was completely insane. Yeah, it could not be done, definitely. It's like the parody of the insane 70s director who is given all the money, except this time he went so far that even in the 70s he did not go.
It's heartbreaking to watch Jodorowsky's Dune to see how close it came to being made, though. It seemed that it was just, short on funding in the final few stages, and he's got the whole thing storyboarded and ready to go. And it's really sad that it never came to fruition. And then, Lynch did what he could, but it was what I'd call a brilliant failure. As we've said, there are redeemable qualities in the film, and fans of films like Flash Gordon, can find a lot to love here. But Villeneuve's film is far superior. One thing that really made me chuckle in David Lynch's film is you've got Patrick Stewart, who plays the role of Gurney. He's obviously depicted as a brave soldier, a fighter, and then you see him running into battle holding his pet dog, a little pug, under his arm, and that cracked me up. Like, what on earth is going to happen to his dog there? It's not a fighting dog, it's just a pug. And that made me chuckle.
I think it's actually the family that trained this dog, so I guess it's like, must protect the dog.
Yeah.
So any dog lover will immediately just add plus 10 points to that, just for the accuracy of how far you will go to protect your dog, I suppose. But I think one of the things that's interesting, though, in watching David Lynch's Dune is just how similar, like, the actual plotting is. Almost all of the same scenes, or at least the core scenes, are included, from how many characters are introduced to the vital moments, and they're handled with very similar selections of dialogue. There's obviously some changes here and there, but I think it's interesting that, clearly, even though Dune is a fairly long book, it's clear what the core moments are, and it's just those two films. Like, a lot of these scenes could just be placed right next to each other. And the comparisons, despite, setting, acting, everything being different, it's still a very similar plot adaptation.
I mean, it's a great example in how plot is not everything, right? You can have two very different films with the same plot.
Absolutely, I think it just shows that get obviously this wasn't really a Lynch film because he compromised so much with the producer, but it really shows just get a different director in, get a different idea in, and you can just, like, the same plot can be anything you want it to be. And that is why it's so sad that Jodorowsky didn't get to do any of it, because in the 70s, I mean, he was at his prime. I mean, he was going to have Orson Welles in this. He was going to have Salvador Dali as the emperor. I mean, it would have been through the roof. And I still remember when I was watching that documentary and I saw the drawings. And I mean, the artist and the team he collected, which the documentary makes a point of too, like, they went on to work on the Alien franchise and other sci-fi franchises, and they actually brought many of those ideas in there. So it's just like the amount of talent that was actually working on this project. I mean, I think it would have been absolutely spectacular.
I highly doubt it would have been a good film. I mean, I don't know. I'm really not convinced. I think the big art book we got from it and the documentary is probably better than whatever the film would have been, but it would have been interesting.
It's possibly true. Like, at least for me, I mean, I love Jodorowsky's surrealist works, and I think, I mean, he really hasn't made, like, at that point, he hadn't made a bad film. And I mean, even his autobiography kind of thing, which is like a 3-parter now. He's done 2 parts already. I'm still waiting for the 3rd. That works too. So I think it would have worked. I think it would have been a genuinely great film. I'm just not sure. It's just too bad he couldn't have, like, done it as a miniseries or done it in installations. Like, why did he have to demand a 7-hour movie with a big studio? I mean, today it would have been no problem whatsoever if we'd have gotten it on Netflix, So it's just proof that I guess filmmakers have more options and chances today.
I don't know. I mean, the 70s, you had a lot of chance, and then Jodorowsky did some crazy films. I sadly haven't seen them, I must admit. I will see them at some point, but yeah, I don't know that you have less opportunities now.
I think only in terms of making longer projects, like in terms of getting funding for anything you wanted. Clearly, the 70s was better because, literally, they were literally negotiating with a surrealist, crazy director to do a major film for a major studio and handle that property, and they were essentially giving him a free rein to do the craziest things in the world, which is just insane. But I think in terms of actually getting something that long made, I think that part is easier than ever before, probably just because of the fact that we have seen a great rise of limited series and that type of content getting larger budgets.
Right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. We get more very long films. Also because of digital, I would guess. I also think it's kind of fun to imagine what Jodorowsky would work out as a Marvel director, which is kind of the trajectory now. Basically, let him do one of two crazy scenes.
I mean, they kind of let Taika Waititi do it, didn't they? With Thor Ragnarok, they just had to like calm it down with the main plot, but they let him go a bit crazy with the gladiator stuff. So, I mean, yeah, it would be really interesting to see.
All three of these directors that have been attached to Dune are some of my favourite directors. So it is a shame that we didn't see Jodorowsky's version, but I don't know how well his surrealistic qualities would have worked with the material. We saw how Lynch's nightmarish approach to it kind of fell through, and he's also a very accomplished director. So I think that finally with Villeneuve, we've got the perfect director because he is so used to creating these grandiose sci-fi films, and as we said, his cold and clinical approach to it really fits the source material very well, and I think that's why he's done the best job. He was perfectly suited to do the adaptation that we were all hoping for.
That's really interesting to say that. I always assumed that the perfect adaptation of this would have been slightly more on the warmer or fun side. But no, I can see your point entirely. And I think it's really worth noting too that Villeneuve actually decided that, like, he has been interested in doing this property for a while, but he wanted the experience first. I mean, his experience in this was actually doing Arrival and then Blade Runner 2049. So I think it's clear that he's kind of been building up to this as well. He's had this on his mind and he's been, handling these bigger sci-fi properties just to make sure he was ready. And that might just be because he saw how Lynch failed by jumping in on his first big production like he did too. So it's nice to see that, we can plan that well and build up that experience and then really go for it.
I think that's part of his ethos as well, because after he directed his film Maelstrom, which I feel bad about because I haven't actually seen it in 2000, he was really disappointed with the film, and he retreated away from directing for 9 years until he directed his next film, because he wanted to build on his experience and make sure that he was up to the task of delivering the film that he wanted to deliver. And it shows again that he's doing this with the sci-fi films, as you explained, Chris. He's been building up to Dune, but I would honestly say that Blade Runner 2049 is his masterpiece, and I don't think that he's going to be able to top that with Dune Part 2, but I will certainly be first in line to find out.
Yeah, I don't think he can quite top Blade Runner 2049 either, though I didn't love it as much as either of you. It is also a really stunning, wonderful, big world, great atmosphere, stunning designs, and I think it just goes that step further. So I struggle to see Dune Part 2 managing to do that, but it's possible. And yeah, I think looking at Villeneuve's style as a sci-fi director, though, like, and just how this type of blockbuster is now actually becoming viable, because Blade Runner 2049 didn't do that well as some people had hoped. While this is actually a genuine blockbuster. I mean, they were actually skeptical of greenlighting Part 2. Like, Villeneuve went into this film without Part 2 greenlit. It was only greenlit after the first numbers came back after the premiere. So this could really just have been one of those films left in the cold without that Part 2, which, if it didn't do well, which would have been an absolute travesty. And a really big risk, and a really big risk as well. So what do you think about this cold, calculated style that Villeneuve is really bringing back to the blockbuster scene?
Well, before getting to that question, I do want to talk about the way in which I think Dune relates to Blade Runner 2049, which, as you mentioned, is a film I absolutely love. And I think a lot of what I love about Blade Runner is two things that Dune doesn't quite do yet, but I see hints of it, right? It is that juxtaposition of some pulpy elements in a very heady, very intellectual sci-fi story. I think it's not much there in Dune, but it is a bit with Duncan Idaho. And perhaps more importantly is this kind of the way he deconstructs the hero's journey, the idea of the chosen one. I think that's the central thing of Blade Runner 2049. It's how these narratives we build for ourselves can be so powerful. And it's interesting in Dune, it's the reverse, right? It's a narrative that is imposed on the protagonist, and how it seems to be a suffocating thing in the film as I see it now, but it's hard to say exactly where Villeneuve is going with it, because we'll see with part two. With regard to this new blockbuster style, it's interesting because I don't think that Dune has been successful. It's been quite successful in France, and everyone around me loves it. It's a weird experience. I'm the least enthusiastic person I know about the film in real life. But it's not like it's a huge blockbuster either. I think it's more like that kind of Christopher Nolan niche, right? Or where you can do big budget and be successful, but it's not like a Star Wars film, right? It's not going to be this insane moneymaker that changes everything. That being
I
said,
love
Christopher
how.
Nolan. So, go ahead, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I just love how you say Christopher Nolan niche, because I mean he's made some of the biggest blockbusters ever, essentially. Like he has
Yeah,
films like.
yeah. What I mean is just like there's not many people like him, right? He's not. He's obviously very popular, but he is doing his thing. I don't think there's many directors you can compare to him, and I think Villeneuve is one of them. And what I was going to get to is that clearly Christopher Nolan with The Dark Knight, he had a huge influence on how blockbusters were made. So I do think something like Dune's can have that effect, maybe, though it will not be as successful as The Dark Knight was. So it's hard to say.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there, and I think it's also very fair to place Nolan and Villeneuve into very similar categories, because those really are the two biggest names that are working within that type of massive budget. And they're both very accomplished directors with very clear artistic visions, very clear styles that are bringing really different elements into that type of hyper mainstream that just is on everybody's lips. Now, I agree, Dune probably won't reach the highest levels of Nolan, but it's in there in the conversation. It's making those numbers. So it will be interesting to see just what type of effect that will be, and if it will indeed be more directors like Nolan and Villeneuve directing films that are topping the box office, or if it will continue to be primarily the type of Star Wars and Avengers films that we have been seeing recently.
I would love to see more films like Dune, and it's clear that Villeneuve and Nolan are paving their own way and doing their own things, and they're being trusted with these incredibly large projects, and it's so encouraging to see. But I think they've both got such distinct visions that are quite difficult to replicate. So I don't think we'll see an influx of similar projects, but I would like to think that these are the kind of films that would inspire potential young filmmakers to make their way into the industry, and will be films that will be talked about for years to come.
To be honest, I kind of hope he doesn't have the kind of influence that Nolan ended up having, because I think that brand of self-seriousness can really be annoying if it's not backed up with an accomplished artistic vision. And so I kind of hope it doesn't happen like you described it, Chris. To be honest.
No, that's fair enough. And like we talked about earlier, I do think that the self-seriousness of Dune is one of its, or rather the fact that it's including in these kind of jokes while being self-serious is one of its weakest points. And if it simply ends up with an other era like the late 2000s era, where, we just got a lot of purposefully bleak films that tried to just be a little bit darker but didn't necessarily have that extra edge. It didn't really do much. The variety is always good as well. Mixing things up is always good. So if you cultivate like a climate where that's more acceptable and where those films do better, I do think that we probably would see more great directors being able to enter that realm as well. So it's a difficult question there, but I actually think I disagree with you. I think that if we allow for blockbusters to be a bit more artistically inclined, or to be a bit more serious, be a bit more ambitious, even if some of those projects or a lot of those projects end up being mediocre, I think it would actually open the ways for a few more directors doing it, just as it's quite possible that Nolan opened the way a little bit for Villeneuve. And I do actually think that one thing that's really interesting to me here is that there's all kinds of comparison made between the way Villeneuve has made this film, like what his approach is. But to me, it feels very classic. I mean, I would almost compare it with David Lynch, for instance, and especially Lawrence of Arabia, which I know is an inspiration for Dune as well, an actual inspiration for the book, which just seems very, especially fitting for Villeneuve to go in that type of direction. But it does actually seem to me that we may be leaning back a little bit to a time when there were a lot of directors that are now considered master directors working in these massive productions. And at least to me, that would be really exciting to see more of.
Yeah, the David Lynch comparison is interesting because I don't think Villeneuve has the romanticism of Lynch at all, but I don't think that's what you were saying, right? You're saying more about the place of a director who makes these hugely popular films and is also, a major author. I don't think we are seeing a change in that. I think the relevant factor happening now is still more the MCU than it is Dune, right? So I think people like Villeneuve, like Nolan, that's why I was saying it's a niche, because not a niche in the sense that it's a small thing, but in the sense that it's very much around an individual who manages to get to that level. I don't think we are seeing systemic change where you have a bunch of major authors are going to do these blockbusters. I just don't see us getting back to that right now.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And you're probably right there, to be honest with you, though it would be great to see. And after going into a bit more of be an historical discussion, if you will, let's bring back the fun factor and play the great new segment that I like to call the pulp factor. So, we've been talking a little bit about the elements in this, and we can play this with Lynch's Dune as well. Maybe we can call it the camp factor. But how pulpy do you think Villeneuve's film actually is? Are there pulp elements in it at all?
Well, there is the pulp element of Duncan Idaho. I think that's really the beginning and the end of it.
Yes.
It's really just him, to me. And so I would say, if we think about it on a scale of 0 to 100, I guess we have to understand what 0 and 100 are, right? So 0 is like an essay film by Straub and Huillet or something like that. And what's 100? I guess Flash Gordon, right? So yes. Dune, on that scale... On that scale, it's like maybe 30 or something, just because sci-fi inherently has some pulp to it. So I guess the baseline for sci-fi is maybe 20, and maybe it's more like a 25. Then let's say that 25.
I think I would go slightly lower, maybe a 20 on the scale. I don't think that pulp is a word that I would have used to describe Villeneuve's Dune. Perhaps it is slightly more fitting for Lynch's Dune, but again, it's not something that would come to mind. I think it takes itself too seriously to be considered a pulp outing.
Yeah, that's a pretty fair point. I mean, pulp is usually associated with low quality, and there's just no denying that this is a very high quality production. But I think I would go with a pulp rating of 30 or perhaps even 35, because to me at least it's not just Duncan Idaho and that character. I agree, that is all pulp, from the the metro hugging to the signs he makes when he goes off to save the day. That is just the pulpy cliches turned up to if not 100, at least 80 or 70. But I think there's a lot of other more pulpy elements here. Like you have a lot of the plotting itself. You have those little jokes like you mentioned earlier, where I am smiling, or it's some of the running into battle for the Duke scenes, some of the other slight comedic efforts in there, and just all of the hero tropes that are played in there. I think Villeneuve will undercut them. I think there'll be some really fun stuff with this in the future, but you have this essentially. It is like Matthieu said, sci-fi is almost inherently pulpy on some level. But when you have these character encounters where they're proving their word quickly with some battling, and it's all of these easy sci-fi genre elements, I just think that the pulp kind of seeps in, and so I would go with 35. But I think that's pretty good. We're all between 20 and 35. We're all well under 50. So I think that if you have to pass 50 to be pulpy, at least, like Dune passed, it's not pulpy. It's declared safe. But what about Lynch's Dune then? And to be more appropriate to it, we can call this additional segment the camp factor. So out of 100, how campy do you think Lynch's work is?
So I do think pulpy and campy to me are different things, but I guess Lynch's Dune is both, so that's fine. It's I don't know, like a 85 or something. It's quite pulpy. One thing I would like to add, though, Chris, is after we answer this, is how would you rate Blade Runner 2049? I think that's an interesting point of comparison.
It is indeed. That's really difficult. I think that the style is turned up even more, but the plot elements there are equally pulpy, to be honest. I think it has that essentially mustache-twirling villain whose whole motive is essentially being villainous. So it's hard to say. I might honestly say it has a higher pulp factor just for a villain alone, put it around 40% maybe, because that one is the one that really just lives and breathes a lot of the genre tropes. And I think because it's even more stylized and not necessarily, it's still cold, it's still Villeneuve, but I think it has more color and it obviously plays even more with the neo-noir tropes, like just as the original Blade Runner does. I think it works and it fits better.
I would agree with your assessment there, Chris. It definitely feels like it owes a lot more to film noir as well, with the mysterious protagonist with a dark past and things like that. And it obviously ramps up the neo-noir, and I think the noir elements do feel a lot pulpier, which obviously they're not present in Dune whatsoever.
And what about the Lynch version, Tom, since you didn't answer that? Because I derailed us.
Well, I think the Lynch version, as you said, it's much closer to pulp than Villeneuve's version. And with the camp factor, when you include that as well, it is probably past 50, maybe going up to the 70 range, I reckon.
Moderate compared to Matthieu's 85, though.
Yeah, I mean, if you put Flash Gordon at the top, although it's on the way to becoming Flash Gordon, I mean,
it's at least on the way there.
Yeah, the Queen soundtrack for Flash Gordon, that is at least 30 points, right? So I'll put Lynch's Dune at 70. That feels right to me.
With regard to Blade Runner, I think I would basically put it at 50. I think that's what makes the film great to me. It's that it has those pulp elements. I think you mentioned the villain, of course, Jared Leto, but also Sylvia Hooks, I think is how it's pronounced. She's basically a henchwoman. I mean, if you have a henchman or henchwoman, you're pulpy. I mean.
Yes. But that's technically what Dune does too, though, with Raban. I mean, he is essentially the henchman.
Yeah, we don't see him that much, right, compared to...
No. Oh, definitely not, no. And like I said, it's just amplified so much more in Blade Runner 2049. So I think for me, if I'm going to rate the camp score of David Lynch's Dune, it's I would honestly go even beyond Matthieu. I would put it at a camp score of 90 or maybe even 95, because this is almost as close to Flash Gordon as you're going to get. Like, you literally have red-headed villains, like this, like kind of, they look like trolls almost, with big bushy eyebrows.
Yeah, the eyebrows. Oh god.
And then you have like we talked about how amazing we thought the shield technology was in Villeneuve's Dune. In Lynch's verse, they're essentially this massive Lego blocks. It's like they're wearing these blue fight suits, or like this, like there's like squares on top of them, and they're squares bouncing into each other. Like, I think all of the factors there, it comes off as just really silly, and to an extent, that's honestly one of the better things with the film. I think it lives and breeds that style of campiness too. So I think it's in some ways a strength, even though the production and the producers, etc., that reeled it in. And I honestly think if that goes slightly further all out, it might have been an even better film.
Yeah, I think Dune, in terms of camp, it just isn't quite self-aware enough to go into camp for me, I think. But it's a fine line.
Yes, it's a very fine line. I think you're on the point there, because like when like you have those kind of like B-50s movie kind of thing going on there, where McLaughlin is laying in bed and he's dreaming and he just goes like, Dune, desert planet, and it's it just feels so pompous and bizarre and stale, and I'm just not sure. Like, I'm really not sure. Was Lynch going all in, like camp fun, real angle? Was he trying to do something more normal? Because some of those scenes really could have been Star Wars or close. Like, I guess you're right. It's not self-aware enough to really cross that barrier. But then again, does camp need to be fully self-aware? I guess that's one of those existential questions. It's hard to answer.
Maybe we'll do a camp episode one day, but yeah, it's too big for this.
It is indeed. So yeah, let's try to book that in, a full-on camp episode. And I think this discussion has almost run its course. So for all of you listeners who have not yet seen Villeneuve's Dune, or maybe David Lynch's Dune as well, let's just enter full-on spoiler territory here. And talk about the ending, talk about the character fates, talk about how we felt about it, what worked, what didn't, and how do we feel about the film just leaving us right there at the end of the story.
Spoiler warning.
Well, that I don't feel great about that. I mean, that is kind of my issue with the film, right? It does not feel like a complete thing. And it's funny because it has kind of the Return of the Jedi thing, not quite to that, not Return of the Jedi, the Return of the King thing, not quite to that point, but with multiple moments that feel like endings. There's one point specifically where like you finally meet like Zendaya, and she says, "This is only the beginning." And I was thinking, oh yeah, well, obviously you ended there, but there's actually 25 minutes left or something. So I do think it's awkward, right? I think he needed like the 4+ hours, but he couldn't do it in one film, so he kind of almost arbitrarily ended it where he ended it. Yeah, I don't think it's the most natural thing, and I don't think it works great.
Yeah, I was also slightly disappointed with how it ended. It's natural for a film that is split into two parts that it can't feel like a contained work, but it does leave some disappointment with the viewer because it doesn't feel like a natural place to really cut the story in two. From what I've seen of the story in Lynch's version, it feels like it was just an arbitrary point that they've reached in the story to stop. But having said that, I still absolutely loved the experience, and it wasn't enough to take away my enjoyment of the film. If anything, it's got me hyped up for the second one. And while we're talking about the ending as well, I'll now mention the other aspect of the film that I found really frustrating, which is when you see Paul riding the sandworm. It just felt so out of place, and it felt almost silly. I didn't like how it was depicted. Just the whole film being so serious and crisp and perfect, and then it just felt a little daft to me. I don't know if you found that scene similarly jarring, but it didn't work, I don't think.
I guess it didn't. I don't know. I did not. It did not particularly shock me. I guess it's a dream vision, right? So yeah, it did not particularly register as something that weird to me.
Yeah, I think this is one of those elements there that, like, I didn't really mind it too much. I didn't mind any of the slightly more pulpy or silly elements that much, honestly, because it is handled fairly well. It's just like a slight blip. But yeah, no, I think one of my least favorite moments was also one of the most pulpy moments, and since it's a bit of a spoiler, I can reveal it now. But it's the execution of the traitor, which I'm not gonna, if you're still listening and you just want mild spoilers, I won't spoil it too much. But essentially, there's a traitor in the Atreides mist, and this character does it for his wife. He wants to save his wife, and because the Harkonnens has kidnapped her, and essentially he goes in there, and there's like, oh, you can join your wife, and then they kill him. Like, that's one of probably the most campy moment, or one of the most campy moments in the entire film. It's just such a fairly conventional pulpy moment. So I really didn't enjoy how that was done. It was just so obvious.
Well, yeah, I think the Harkonnen. Go ahead, Tom.
I didn't mind that aspect, and it was that exact scene is also in Lynch's version, so it's clear that that's what Herbert intended, and I thought it was handled quite well, to be honest. But
I think to me that shows your reaction kind of shows the limits of the self-seriousness. Is that I don't think the Harkonnen are meant to be characters. They are more meant to be an embodiment of greed, right? And like the Atreides are more meant to be an embodiment of a kind of dignity, but dignity that is not perfect, right? And I think maybe so that moment played fine for me, but that's because I guess I have that context, and I can see how, because Villeneuve takes it quite seriously. I mean, it's not that it's not taken seriously in the book, but I guess the approach is a bit different, and I can see how, that moment cannot work with Villeneuve's style.
No, I think that's pretty much it. I mean, I didn't absolutely hate it. It's just one of those points that just, that type of plotting didn't feel quite at home in a film that's made quite this way.
I guess with regards to the ending, I think he does choose a moment that's important to finish it, right? It's kind of Paul accepting his destiny in a sense with that fight and becoming a man and all that. But it's such a straightforward application of the hero's journey that I think will be subverted. And so maybe that's part of my frustration with the film, where it's because we end on a point where it's not being subverted. But that's also why I wait for part 2, right? I think we're not going to stay on that.
No, I think you're completely right, and that's I think that was a really easy point to end it on, but it really felt like an anticlimax as well.
Yeah.
There's so many other points or times that it could theoretically have ended, and the way they did it felt a little bit like it was a TV episode. Like, it felt a little bit like this is a mid-season TV episode. It's not an important climax. It's just like we are going to go here now. There's some slight anticipation of what they'll do. That's probably it just fizzled out a little bit, and that's fine. It owns up to it. It calls itself part 1. It's not like I just think that he and his writers could probably have ended it on a slightly higher note, where they felt like a film and its sequel, or a normal duology, rather than literally just part 1 and part 2. Because with that, you genuinely, just in every way, it really is just find a reasonable point to shop it, and then shop it there, and it's not the high point, not post climax. It's just shop it at any point that kind of feels fitting, and Yeah, I agree with you. That was a slight low point. But then again, like you've been saying, we don't know what is going to happen. I mean, you read the book. I've seen the previous adaptation, so we have a decent clue. But part 2 is coming. The tale will be complete, and I think that's probably going to be the more exciting part here, because we will then get a complete work, if you will. I mean, this may be one of those few films, like, say, Ten Nibelungen from the 20s, which, people will add to the list as a unified whole if part 2 really works. Just because the distinction is so vague. It is clearly set up as one work. So what are your hopes and your expectations of part 2? Do you think it will live up to, surpass, deliver on their expectations? Like, what are your thoughts on part 2?
I think it's got a great chance of exceeding my expectations, if I'm honest. I think that with Dune, Villeneuve has established an excellent foundation for him to build upon his characters and his storyline that he's introduced to us. If we compare it to Blade Runner 2049, for instance, I think one of the reasons why I love that so much is that it's in an established world, and he was able to build on Scott's foundation to bring us something new. And now with Dune, he's established this foundation, so he's able to take us to other places in the second one without having to go through all the introductions, the character development, etc. And there's clearly going to be a lot of huge action set pieces, etc., from what I've seen in Lynch's version. So I've really got high expectations, and I think if anyone can meet them, it's probably Villeneuve.
So I guess what I want / expect, or at least definitely want from part 2, is for it to be very different compared to part 1. I mean, stylistically in line, but maybe tonally and just what it's saying different. Tom talked about it laying the foundations. Well, I kind of want him to blow up the foundations, right? so that's, yeah, I just want something that is going in a different direction while still being coherent, of course. So I'm very curious to see it. I'm reasonably excited about it.
Yeah, I think I'm closer to Tom here. Yeah, I think I have fairly high expectations for it. I think part 2 will be a great film. I think I would be very shocked if Villeneuve could not deliver. He is, a director at his prime here. I think he's established himself as a master director. I think he has the tools at hand. He has the freedom at hand to really go ahead and do this the way he wants to. So it would be a colossal surprise to me if he, at the very least, could not make a film that, visually, tonally, atmospherically, in terms of craft, etc., couldn't live up to part 1. And then the question is, will the plot allow him to? Will he make any changes to the plot? Will the new characters, the casting, etc., cause some additional issues? There's certainly things that could lean into being slightly worse or slightly better. So I'm sharing some of Matthieu's feelings here. I would like it to, blow the presumptions up a little bit here, to be a little bit more dangerous. I'm not sure if it has the ability to do that, but I'm really excited to see what it's going to be. And at the very least, I think it will be a similarly great but somewhat straightforward epic action sci-fi adventure. And if that's the floor, it might be lower. I might be shocked, but if that's the floor, I'm very, very happy regardless. And it's quite high on my list of anticipated films.
My one reservation is that the film's already got a release date, so we're expecting to see it on the 20th of October 2023, which, it's just under 2 years away, but I don't know if that's going to put extra pressure on Villeneuve and his crew when really we want to give him all the time in the world to make sure he can continue the story in the best way possible. It might be enough time for him, but we'll have to wait to see. And it's also quite encouraging to hear that he's already mentioned some potential plans for a trilogy with the third movie adapting Dune Messiah for the screen. So, if all things go well, we could have at least 2 more Dune movies coming our way. And that is just excellent news. Very exciting.
I mean, you could have even more. Like, there are a lot of Dune books. But I think with regards to the release date, I would say the past year and a half has proven that release dates are never set in stone. So I guess I'm not that worried about that.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I agree with that.
Yeah, I think he has his foundations down here too. He has most of his cast. So, I mean, there might be a lot of, since the second film was not greenlit, there might be a lot of set construction. We're probably going to be seeing, the Fremen cities, etc. It's going to be really exciting to see how they're built. We might also see other planets, so there might just be a lot of prepping and planning there going into it that could stall it. But I think that when you have a solid foundation like this, I don't think meeting that deadline is going to be that hard. And if it is, let's hope they move it for him. So it's a good point, Tom. I'm going to be cautiously concerned about it, but I think he'll deliver. I think I would be very shocked if he could not deliver on this time frame. And as I did not know there could be a trilogy, that's even more exciting. So we're really going to see Villeneuve doing one of the things he does best, possibly 2 times in a row now, or 3 times in a row, counting this, and just continue to excel, hopefully, as a sci-fi director. And while it would also be exciting to see him go in entirely different directions, I think that this kind of arc for him is going to be really exciting to see and might give him a really good boost too in what they can do later.
If we're bringing in that comparison to Nolan once again, could this be his Dark Knight trilogy?
Ooh, indeed, it really could be. And with that optimistic final note there, I think we're at the perfect spot to end the episode. I hope you've all enjoyed listening to us, because we've certainly enjoyed talking through Dune. Thank you so much for listening, and join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.